So my first ever video on this channel was a list of my favorite games for each year I was alive. And you know what? I like some older games too. So in this video, I'm going to be going over my favorite game for each year I wasn't alive. Or before I was born, to be more specific. I don't exactly know what my favorite games will be when I'm dead. But anyways, I've always had a really big fascination with games from previous generations, especially ones that came out before I was born. It's great to know the influences of games that are out today and how the industry was shaped by them. And oftentimes, video games from olden days can be more fun and unique than games released today. Heck, some of the first media about video games outside of them I consumed as a kid were YouTube videos that are retrospectives on old Pokemon, Mario, or Smash Bros. Games. And it gave me a greater appreciation for the new titles I loved so much. Now, I'm going to go over every year since 1985 and explain what my favorite video game that originally released in that year is and why. The year has to be the game's original release in their region, even if it didn't come to North America that year. I know 1985 isn't exactly the first year video games started being good, but I picked that one specifically because, do you need me to explain why Pac-Man is fun? Anyways, that's about it. So let's start with 1985 with a pretty obvious pick, Super Mario Bros. Yeah, a lot of picks on here are gonna be obvious, but hey, that's the beauty of a video like this. I get to bring my own perspective on classic games that way too many people have already talked about for me to justify making a whole video. Anyways, from a modern perspective, Super Mario Bros. Feels restrictive to play. I haven't really heard too many people talking about this, but the movement is fairly slow and restricted, and you can't even walk backwards like the other games. That's why this game is so good, because it's designed around this restriction, and it enhances the experience. Not unlike the first game I talked about in my favorite game each year I was alive video. The precision of the platforming is almost perfect, and the levels feel like they know the player. Look at the Warp Zone in 1-2 for example. The game knows players, skip their levels and reward them for wanting to do what they'll naturally want to do in a game like this, go on that ceiling. Super Mario Bros. Was not only one of the first platformers, it was one of the first games to reward player experimentation, and the fact that it does this while also having its restrictions makes it a title that's just as fun as it is influential. Some points can be a little lame, whole last maze in Bowser's Castle, but overall it's a piece of history I'll never forget. Moving on to 1986, my pick is Outrun. A game so iconic it inspired a whole genre of music, even if that music sounds literally nothing like the music of the actual game. Outrun was on the cutting edge of video games of its time, and it still looks beautiful, and plays well too. It's little more than driving around, and the core gameplay experience isn't that much to write home about, but the vibe of the whole experience is what makes it a classic. With its incredibly satisfying sound design and super upbeat and fun music adding together to make this simple gameplay loop fun every time. There's also an element to it that makes it relaxing every time too. This is not related to the quality of the game in any way, but I find it funny that people associate this game with synthwave when it neither looks nor sounds anything like that aesthetic. It never has, and I don't think there's a game in the series that does. Where did anyone get the idea that the game looks like this? My pick for 1987 is Final Fantasy. Yes, I'm a little surprised to be putting it here too. The game is confusing. Most of the time it won't communicate very well where to go, and way too much of this relies on money or gil. Sure, you get a lot of it for defeating enemies, and it isn't as big as an issue as it could be, but things like reviving party members after they die and getting spells should not have to cost such a scarce resource as money in a game. But other than that, it's a great time. Early RPGs have such a charm to them when you're just given a vague direction and told to go off in the world to figure things out. And Final Fantasy captures this charm well, while also giving you just enough direction so you actually know what you're doing. It's not as poorly designed as you would expect. I went in thinking it would be similar to, say, the first Dragon Quest, and I was pleasantly surprised when I was wrong. Battles are very tedious at times, but are not actually all that hard, and the game lets you try out different party builds whenever you start a new game, which can let you figure out where your strength lies and take advantage of it. You can even make multiple Warriors of Light have one class, meaning if you want to screw yourself over with 4 white mages, you can. Or if you want to do insane amounts of damage with 3 fighters or monks and heal with a white mage, you can do that too. I love it when you can choose a game like that, and in a way that makes it easier but still challenging and fun. You can get by fairly easily without grinding too if you know what you're doing, which is genuinely impressive for a game like this. The need for a grind is why I give up pretty easily on some JRPGs, despite how much I love the genre. I mean, I didn't play all of Final Fantasy 1, but I did like what I did play of it, and God knows I enjoyed it more than early Dragon Quests or Phantasy Stars. The story is pretty simple too, but enjoyable, and the world established a baseline that a whole new host of sequels and edgy prequels built upon, which means you can't help but appreciate this little RPG. Maybe it doesn't stand out on its own too well, detached from the sequels that followed it, but it is worth giving a shot for the video game history element alone. You might find yourself enjoying it more than you'd expect, or not, I don't know you. Punch-Out would have gotten this spot if it wasn't technically based on a game from 1984. So, you know what I realized about my iconic award-winning favorite game each year I was live video? All of my game picks were from different years. They were also from different series. I didn't have a single series that got multiple entries in the video, unless you count Undertale and Deltarune. That will not be true for this video, as Super Mario Bros. 3 is my 1988 pick. While Super Mario Bros. 1's main draw is that it's built around the restrictions of the character, Mario 3 feels like its main draw is the opposite. Your character is very fast and has a huge range of motion, and the game manages to provide more of its challenge around that, with platforming set pieces that are bigger and more complicated than the original Super Mario Bros., while still working around the player and still providing that knowledge of the player Super Mario Bros. 1 had. The biggest example of this would be the gimmicks in the game. Many levels include a thing like a moving platform you have to jump to move on, or an infamous angry sun, and apply the essential design style of introducing these new elements to players in a safe environment before providing the real challenge later. Now this sounds basic, but Mario 3 has one of the best uses of this in the series, with just enough gimmick levels or new levels to keep things fresh while not too wacky. And these safe environments to which your gimmicks are introduced are still really fun to go back to, so it's not like you're playing a tutorial. You're just re-experiencing a part of the level. There are lots of other parts of this game too that make it a great time. The world map gives you more choice and enhances the game by letting you discover secrets. The new power-ups are an absolute blast to use, and the airship levels are all such a chaotic mess of cannons and bullet bills, which carefully navigating is just as fun as it is stressful. Super Mario Bros. 3 is not just the best game of 1988, but I think it's better and maybe even more influential for the series than Super Mario Bros. 1 was. For 1989's Game of the Year, we're moving back to arcades with my pick, Strider. What really stands out to me about this game, and the reason I like it so much, is the action and sound design. As this is a ninja platformer, your character feels really powerful, and the platforming is light compared to the action, which is super satisfying, especially given that, sword swing noise. But yes, this game is a perfect blend of action and platforming, which always makes you feel powerful, despite how brutally difficult it is. Here you control is very light, and he has a jump arc that's pretty unique, which helps make this game stand out from the other platformers of the era. Even other ninja platformers, a genre I really like, by the way. The atmosphere is pretty cool too, and so are some of the boss designs. You fight a mechanical ape and dinosaurs, and in the first level you fight a centipede made out of communists. This game is so good, and I'm genuinely surprised it hasn't become a bigger franchise. On to 1990, Super Mario World. This game perfects everything that was done in SMB3, and it's awesome for it. The movement, speed, and possibilities of this game all feel like a step up in the best way possible, as it's bigger and plays faster and more precise, while also having its own distinct feel. I actually flip-flop between whether or not I prefer World or 3, and I feel like the answer usually comes down to whichever one I played more recently, just because Mario controls similarly but still very different in both games. And they both provide a great challenge to each Mario incarnations. About World specifically, when you played it a few times, some of the levels go by super quickly, and are constantly throwing new stuff at you, leaving just enough time to get used to the current one before a new exciting thing happens. This makes the game very memorable. It feels like a theme park. There's always something new to enjoy. Secret exits or alternative levels were a brief part of 3, and here they're a main feature, making no two playthroughs feel the same. Believe me, I played through this one a lot. If you remember from my Every Game I Was Alive video, I seldom do that. This was a great start to Nintendo's side of the 16-bit era. As much as I do love Sega, Nintendo had some of the peak 2D platformers on the SNES, and that 100% describes Mario World. Onto a game that actually released on SNES and Genesis, Street Fighter II. Yeah, the later versions are better. Super Street Fighter II has always been my favorite, but the first one is good too. The combat of this game is slow, but it is also intricate and strategic, and it is filled with personality. Attacks do a lot of damage, but are fairly easily avoided or blocked, meaning the risk-reward factor of this game is super high, which is especially fun when you're playing with friends. Each character has a really fun toolset too, making them all feel unique. The game is my personal favorite soundtrack for any fighting game ever, and these character themes add a lot of personality to each character. There's a reason it was such a big deal when their themes got replaced 30 years later in Street Fighter VI. It's genuinely surprising this game is still so good. The strengths and weaknesses of each character are all very well constructed. Test another opponent by fighting their weaknesses is amazing in both competitive and arcade play, especially with the bosses. The YouTube channel Design Talk has a great video on that, which I'd recommend. Next up, my pick is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. While Mario had some of the most fun and polished 2D platformers, Sonic got some of the most fun and bullshit 2D platformers. This is a game that is very unfair, with a lot of stupid elements, that relies way too much on trial and error when you restart the game every time you die. But some of the highs, really great segments, soar just as high as those of Mario. One of the things I found most fun about Mario World was how fast it is. That's obviously the entire point of Sonic 2. The super fast speed is experienced unlike anything else, and while the low points are really bad, it's still one of the best 2D platformer experiences ever if you turn it off at Metropolis Zone. And those points I made about Mario throwing a lot of things at you and letting you explore, yeah, I think the best parts of Sonic does that things better. It's great. I have mixed feelings on this game, in case you couldn't tell, but I can absolutely see why people consider this better than Mario back in the day, even if I don't agree. And obviously I like it a little bit if it's my favorite of 1992. Moving on to 1993, it's Doom. Doom is the kind of game that you can get buy-in if you're playing carefully and slowly, but the real fun comes in learning all the ins and outs and mastering the game. You're gonna die quite a bit on the level if you're playing it for the first time, but you just have to keep on trying over and over again, and eventually, through a concoction of half willpower and half skill, you'll have made it through. Doom's levels are mazes when you first play them, but when you complete them a few times after, you get so knowledgeable you could probably close your eyes and trace back the whole level in your head. And the level design is pretty good too, giving plenty of secrets and alternative ways to take on a challenge, so you're never really bored while playing the game. The way this game eases you in by throwing you a difficult level, having you die a lot, and then take it on again with a better understanding of the game, can turn any casual player into a fan of this game. And not even that, probably a fan of boomer shooter games. Doom also features lots of different types of weapons and ammo, and you need to constantly be picking up more to progress and be more powerful, which I really love. It shakes up the game a lot, and it's genuinely exhilarating when I find a stash of good weapons, and there's probably some demon guarding it. It also adds to the sense of mastery of a level too, given how you'll probably remember where these weapons are located. When I look back at games of this era, it's genuinely impressive that a game that feels this fluid and fun released in 1993, and how big a step up it was from its earlier games about shooting demons. 1994 was the first year here where it was genuinely difficult to make a pick. I debated Dr. Mario earlier for 1990. No, I didn't seriously consider it, but it was a thought in my mind. And I thought for a second or two about Shinobi 3 for 1993, but besides those two, I didn't really have any huge honorable mentions. This all changes, however, with 1994, where the choice between Super Metroid and Donkey Kong Country was incredibly difficult. but still, I'll have to give it to Super Metroid. When I first played this game, believe it or not, I kind of hated it. I found it too confusing, and maybe I was a little too young, but it just didn't captivate me. Then I learned how to slow down, stop being a stupid kid, and it became one of my favorites. This is a game you need to be paying a lot of attention to in terms of the environment. You need to be conscious of every unexplored area on a map, and you need to have paid attention to those dead ends. But I don't think that's asking very much of the player, because this game makes you naturally want to do that. If you're not a dumb kid rushing through it, probably using save states after every minuscule obstacle. Ugh. But yeah, the aesthetic and tone of this game is beautifully constructed. It makes every area beautiful and memorable, and some puzzles or solutions might be a little too out there, not very well conveyed. The new bridge, for example, but 99% have such subtle yet informative cues, which force you to really use your brain and find out a solution to progress. It can be as simple as a high jump you can't get to, or more complex, like a tunnel you have to bomb, which you find out by seeing another tunnel cracked open. Backtracking is usually something I don't particularly like in video games, but in Super Metroid and many other Metroidvanias, the previous areas still offer you something new and continue to be challenging. It makes backtracking a feature, not a hindrance. The platforming is honestly pretty sucky sometimes. Samus's movement is more vertically inclined than horizontally, which can be lame at times when you have to platform horizontally, but that's a minor gripe. Doesn't even matter that much, just because how fun, engaging, and memorable the rest of the game is. It definitely won't change how legendary it is either. And the tradition of me thinking really hard about one of two picks, and one of those picks being Donkey Kong, yeah, it carries over to 1995, where at first I didn't know if Chrono Trigger or Donkey Kong Country 2, and so sorry to you, KC2. I already have a video where I go over why I like Chrono Trigger, so I won't go too in depth, but basically Chrono Trigger is a pretty simple game compared to other RPGs at the time, like Final Fantasy, in both the characters and the story. It's still an RPG, it's certainly no baby's first JRPG, but it still has relatively simple gameplay and characters. Maybe not a simple story, but yes, simple characters. And while this can be sometimes a fault, the simplicity is also a big reason why it's good. The turn-based battles have a lot of depth to them, but they're simple enough that each encounter or boss isn't overwhelming. There's also next to no grinding. The only time I had to was Giga Gaia, but it honestly wasn't a big deal. That's super impressive for a JRPG of the time. The characters have tons of personality and flair, again, yeah, even if they're simple, and it comes through mostly in animations and attacks, more so than dialogue. Frog and Magus, for example, are some of my favorite characters in any RPGs ever. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best one, but Chrono Trigger is definitely top 3 favorite RPGs. Okay, I definitely described this in depth, didn't I? There are a lot of video games that have genuinely blown me away. Even games that have genuinely blown me away just by how it looks or feels. And naturally, I felt this while playing Super Mario 64. But with this game, it feels like it blown me away just by seeing it. Just by being able to control it and move around in the environment. Super Mario 64 is nothing short of magical. I first played this game through 3D All-Stars. I couldn't get a 64 emulation to work before, believe me, I tried, and I was completely hooked. I just haven't played a game like it before. I remember sitting in my class with thoughts racing in my head about where I'll go next, what I'll try, what I'll do when I get home, and play Super Mario 64. It took me like 2 days to beat it. This game has a huge legacy, so I was a little bit skeptical at first when I first tried it. But simply the act of being in Super Mario 64, the way Mario feels while running around, is incredible. It feels like a theme park like Mario World. An entire world where you're simply just allowed to run around, play at your own discretion. Try to collect as many stars as possible. But to be honest, it feels more genuine than a theme park or playground. It feels like the world just is. It doesn't feel like a game made to entertain. A world you're just around in. I've been talking quite generally about this game. I do apologize if I'm not getting too specific, but I think that's a big part of the appeal of this game. it feels big, it feels hard to understand, and huge at times. And that's why so many people will try to find out little secrets about its mechanics or make those creepypastas about it. And that's all because this feels more like a genuine world. I don't mean that lightly. It feels more genuine than even real open world games like Breath of the Wild or Skyrim. Obviously not as realistic, but it does feel more genuine in a way that's harder to quantify. This game is probably one of the most analyzed / discussed video games of all time, and given how the world feels and how it's like to be in, it makes sense. For 1997, my pick is Castlevania Symphony of the Night, because I am just so cultured in terms of video games. I've played all the classics. Serious though, in so far I feel like there are only like 2 games on this list you couldn't really make the case for them being the best in their genre. But anyways, if you don't know basically anything about video games, you will know that Symphony is one of the many classics on this list for good reason. Symphony has a similar style of gameplay to Super Metroid, but it focuses generally away from atmosphere towards action, although atmosphere is definitely still a priority. This game has some issues not really present in Super Metroid. The difficulty scaling is off since bosses seem to start harder and get easier as you go on, and the exploration is more confusing than Super Metroid's. But comparing them isn't the point, because Symphony is great for other reasons. The exploration is more satisfying. Okay, yeah, I just said the point was to compare games, but some points require comparison. For the simple fact that this entire map of the world can be easily viewed just by pressing one button. This makes it very satisfying to explore, just to fill out that much more of your map. It feels like it gives you this sort of pride and ownership over the map you discovered. The action is some of the best in any 2D platformers out in the era, and the action of older Castlevanias works perfectly in this new style. It was a pretty big jump from the slower, lumbering Belmonts to Alucard's fast gameplay, but he works great with the old enemies. Getting in a couple quick hits and backdashing to avoid an enemy's hit feels really good, man. And Symphony works not in spite of these Castlevania enemies, but because of them. 1998. I think I have a choice though kind of unexpected, at least compared to everything else, because these are pretty well-known picks. It's Xenogears. This game is a transcendent experience. The main turn-based combat is alright compared to some other JRPGs. It's not all that complicated, but holy shit with everything else. The world looks beautiful, and it has a great look to it with the 2D sprites on a 3D world. It really will stick with you long after you play. And this story, oh god, this is an overwhelming game. Despite me putting it on the list, I haven't actually beaten this one. So who knows, maybe the last 2/3 of this game are the worst thing ever and I'm wrong for putting it here. I don't know. But anyways, it's absolutely huge and maybe even a little too big because it's very hard to get into. Even if you know the story, it's just so complicated, hard to understand, which is a valid issue, don't get me wrong. But the story has some of the deepest and best explorations of philosophical themes in video games. This is a game you can discuss for decades and still barely scratch the surface, and people have. It's powerful, and watching videos or discussion of this game is one of the most fun things I've done related to video games in general. The game is like one of the most anime things ever. Final Fantasy mixed with Evangelion, mixed with 30 different things, and with the cute mascot who gets crucified. No one said this game was subtle about those themes. Anyways, this is way too big an experience to be discussed here, so go watch a 2-hour video essay on it or something. I'm not qualified to cover this. His name is Choo Choo, by the way. His name is Choo Choo, and he gets crucified. Okay, my pick for 1999 is kind of cheating, but I think it has enough changes to count as a proper sequel and thus its own game. It's Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. Fight for the future. Everyone always forgets about the fight for the future. Anyways, this game feels silky smooth, super fun to play, and the atmosphere and music is top notch. The game really feels like the developers had a passion, and it was what they really wanted to make. The first 2 Street Fighter 3 games did not sell well, but they made this one anyways, and it was worth it, with new stages and endings, which was why it counts as a sequel in my book. There is so much personality to each of the characters. Just the way they attack and move, and often how they use some really weird techniques. It's made them everlasting in the eyes of players. Even the characters who haven't returned in Street Fighters 4 and 5 have become icons. If I had to use one word to describe this game, it would be refined. Yeah, it might not be that balanced competitively, but there's such a high level of refinement and precision that's put into each character's toolkits, which takes into account so many different possibilities, provides a lot of counters to each character's moves. It's super impressive. Not only does each character feel distinct, they feel like a completely different fighting game, in a way that still manages to make it cohesive. For example, my favorite character in the game, Makoto, because of the way you have to pay attention to your opponent's movement. Find a movement which will rush in with her. Just to find a move which you'll rush in with at her Hayate, way more than you do at other fighting games. And the characters are just so fluid and well animated. Makes me love it. Playing this game never gets old, not only because of the gameplay, but because how beautiful it is. This game was a big risk, it really was. But you'd better believe it was worth it, it's so good. This leads us to another fighting game for 2000, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes. Everyone always forgets about the New Age of Heroes part. While Third Strike was the pinnacle of precision in fighting games, MVC2 is the pinnacle of chaos, smashing together all these iconic characters in a beautiful and messy fighting game. It's the Poutine of fighting games. Looks so chaotic, but is incredible. You can move super fast. The combo potential is limitless, literally and figuratively, and it's a game that's very easy to get into. If you're button mashing, it's almost a guarantee you'll be doing something crazy and cool. But if you actually get good and figure out the situations where you can use these characters' moves, you can do even crazier and cooler things, managing to just briefly control the chaos in your favor for a moment. The game has a huge roster thanks to the way it uses assets of other games, but it also introduces its own. This leads to some strange picks, like an overabundance of Street Fighter characters and X-Men, which is odd, but it definitely gives a sense of identity, because I feel like a celebration of both Capcom and Marvel's 90s stuff. Some picks are just bad though. Surfbot as a separate character, Wolverine with bone claws as a separate character slot as Wolverine with adamantium claws, not a palette swap, a separate character. Like, you could cut those two and just had a roster of 54. But I digress. The roster is still great and genuinely really impressive. The new characters are great too, fit in pretty well. Abyss will always be a real Marvel villain in my eyes, and I hope Amingo gets added to a Darkstalkers sequel. And I hope they make a Darkstalkers sequel. MVC2 is a mess, and everyone should experience trying to tame it. Just like poutines. Metal Gear Solid 2, the entry I'm picking for 2001, is a game that I went in with a little bit of bias against, just a pinch. I knew that much of the hate from it comes from people who are just salty about Raiden. Something that's, still true. But back then I thought there'd be something with the design or story that would be really bad for whatever reason. That's not true at all. In the original MGS1, the whole layout of Shadow Moses Island was just a little confusing. It ends up being an issue because it requires a lot of backtracking. This game requires backtracking too, but it's much less confusing when it actually makes sense. It's pretty cool. The stealth mechanics are a huge step up. You have just enough tools and abilities to get around unseen and take out guards efficiently. Stealth is an annoying thing usually, so it's pretty impressive that the series makes it good. The bosses are very memorable and will stick in your mind for a long time after. This might be unpopular, but to this day, Fat Man is still my favorite boss in the whole series. Vulcan Raven comes close though. Just something about the way action is blended with running around looking for bombs. Such a high-stakes situation makes that boss fight exhilarating. I only just wish there were a few more characters for you to fight against in boss battles, but it's not the biggest deal since what is here is good. The game throws a lot of these high-stakes situations at you, like a sniper battle or looking for a secret informant among some hostages, and that's pretty fun too. The story is like Xenogears in that, God, I feel unqualified to talk about it, but you know what? I'll try. I love the characters of this game. The way all their stories come together is super compelling. And the moment Emma Emmerich died is the first time a video game ever made me cry. And sure, later on with all its plot twists, it can get a little confusing, but it's not nearly as bad as people say. Basically, if you have reading comprehension and are paying full attention to all of its details, you'll be fine. You'll know enough to understand it even at the end with all its plot twists. The themes of the story deal with many things, such as control, military, and misinformation in the context of the digital age. That's something obviously very pressing today, and has already been the cause of a lot of political violence or other problems. Metal Gear Solid 2 predicted all of this in 2001, and I've repeated this phrase a lot, but the fact that a video game showed us is a testament to the power of the medium and its storytelling. This is not the last Metal Gear I will talk about in this video, and I definitely want to talk about the series in further detail later down the line in a separate video. I still have a very, very fond recollection about when I first bought Metroid Prime, my favorite game of 2002. I had about $25 left at a convention because I spent way too much money getting a book signed, and I found a booth selling old video games, including GameCube games. I had an old GameCube my parents bought a while ago, for context. I did not expect to really be able to get any of them, but I was looking anyways, and I found this game for $20. Literally $20 for a GameCube game. Look at the price for 90% of GameCube games, including this one on eBay. It will not be $20. I was so lucky to be able to experience this game, and I loved it. Well, I thought it was okay the first time. Then I replayed Super Metroid, then I replayed this game, and I liked it even more. My stupidness when it comes to not properly experiencing games does not only apply to 2D ones. Believe it or not, Metroid Prime has exploration, and it is fun. You get slightly less of a cathartic relief just from seeing a map filled out, but much more from looking around a planet, uncovering its lore, and forming an idea of this world in your own head. Talon 4 is inseparable from Metroid Prime. That might seem obvious, but really, how much of Super Metroid is really that tied to the story of Planet Zebes? Or Metroid Dread with ZDR? That's not really a problem with those 2D games, it's just a thing Prime does better. The planet is almost its own character. The game also features action better than 2 previous Metroids, and while it isn't perfect, platforming is a step up as well. Some of the areas like the space pirate base can get pretty tiring when the focus is mainly on action. That entire area just feels okay, but in the game normally the combat is subtle and not distracting from the main reason you play it. Well, I guess bosses are an exception, but come on, you're playing Metroid. Of course you want to fight some cool bosses, and the boss fights here are absolutely cool and really add to the experience. Okay, so we're almost done with this video, just have 2 more left. So my pick for 2003 is another RPG, Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne. SMT has a lot of things that usually turns me off from games. I don't typically like frequent dungeons and high levels of difficulty in RPGs, but this game makes those flaws features. The dungeons have plenty of challenge, and I like the puzzles, but they definitely don't overstay their welcome like they do in something like Persona 5 in my opinion. The turn-based combat is unbelievably fun. It is very difficult, but there are so many moments where you can figure the game out and overcome this challenge, which makes you feel powerful. Not only that, it makes you feel like the most powerful demon in the land, like you can do anything with your team. So, when you get your ass handed to you by another boss and you have to change your strategy a bit to beat it, it almost tells a meta story about your character learning about himself. All sorts of demons from different mythologies are represented in this game, and the game adapts to the designs in a way that's really cool and gives the game its own distinct look. And they really are from different mythologies all over the world, from Japanese mythology to Greek mythology to Christianity, Hinduism to Mothman. This game has a lot of cultures running the world after the apocalypse. It's kind of cool. This is also a subject I love hearing the discussions online with people talking about which designs they like and which mythological figures they want to see. Who knows? Maybe a future video topic. But, yeah, there's an apocalypse, by the way. The game deals with themes of rebuilding and how this world will be built after humans. Not a new thing for this series, but none of the earlier Shin Megami Tensei games really had such an atmosphere and look to the destroyed Tokyo this game takes place in. After playing Persona 5 and going to this, it feels so weird that all the locations in that game are here, but destroyed from a goddamn apocalypse, but made by the same company. I know it's cringe to have a guy go, oh my god, this real-life Japanese location is just like Persona 5, but it is interesting that the same company has 2 different interpretations of the same locations.
And I imagine if I had been to Japan before playing this game, the setting would have been even better. Oh, also soundtrack good. That Fiend battle is probably my favorite boss battle music in any video game ever. And then, finally, 2004, I think you can tell which one this is. Half-Life 2 was heavily considered. I even had an earlier draft where it was the pick, but I just have to give it to Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. Yes, I didn't lie when I said MGS2 would not be the last Metal Gear game on this list. MGS3 is, in a world, that's a step up from the predecessor in a lot of ways. The only thing I think MGS3 doesn't vastly improve on is the bosses and story. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have an even better story, and it's just not vastly improved. Not better bosses, though. The world feels less like a hub to familiarize yourself with, and more like an adventure. This time around, every single location you go to, you'll have memorized in your mind right after, simply because of how well constructed they are, just like MGS2. There are so many small little places to hide or details in each area, meaning this is the kind of game you'll discover something new about every time you play it. I'll be learning new stuff about this game till I die. Its setting is a jungle, somewhere in the USSR, and the setting is so harsh and difficult to survive.
In other games, you've basically got your ass covered if you're not actively fighting someone. It's like, all you need to do is sneak around, do your mission unspotted, except for when you are spotted. But here it's a game of survival in a world that wants you dead, with people who want you dead. Like I mentioned before, I don't think bosses are better than MGS 1 and 2's, but they're still incredible, and the action and stealth in the game is vastly improved due to the simple addition of a CQC, making it much easier and more fun to take out guards without killing them, giving you a lot of replay value if you want to do a no-kill run. To a degree, it even kind of makes some of the previous games hard to go back to, with their clunky ways of needing you to punch guards with a 3-hit jab. But all of that is not the part of the game I remember the most all these years after. Like 3. Wasn't that long ago I played this. But anyways, that would be the story. Similarly to MGS2, this deals with complicated themes. Here it's about the treatment of soldiers, the paranoia of the Cold War, and the artificiality of borders and conflicts. And a soldier who abandons their country upon realizing this. This is a game that has a very well thought out story. There are a lot of characters like MGS2, they all come together in a really smart way. They're all very well written, and I like how characters have a lot of quirks, like liking movies or being oblivious to racism, which can add comedic relief in a natural and non-distracting way, since you basically need to seek this out via codex to find it. The ending is very powerful too, probably my favorite ending in any video game out there. No spoilers, but it's a tearjerker for sure. If you think about it, this game is basically a setup game to establish plot lines and the Big Boss and Patriots things for MGS4, but that doesn't make it boring at all. It just makes it feel like a really, really good way to start the timeline of this series. After looking back on the years before I was alive, it really makes me realize just how if a game is a classic, there's probably a reason for it. All the games I talked about here have good design, memorable moments, and a legacy that is 100% deserved. And they're important to look for inspiration, but they have a lot of flaws as well, which manifest or just become more obvious with age. It's not a reason to ignore these games. It's a reason to look even harder, and to see how the concepts introduced in these games can be improved upon. And if we really do it, maybe we can make something on the same or higher level than the classics. Every year before 2005 was, of course, dark and miserable time because no one was graced with my presence, but at least they had some good video games. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.